Well, 10 years ago, Julia Gillard made an appalling speech in which she sought to distract the electorate from the repulsive misogyny of her chosen speaker, the repugnant Peter Slipper, who had been sending out texts likening parts of the female anatomy to certain items that you'd normally expect to find on the seafood platter on a beachside restaurant. But to Julia Gillard, this merely presented an opportunity for a vicious, sneering, abusive tirade against her opponent, Tony Abbott. With a grab bag of supposedly sexist actions and comments Abbott had made over the years, which Gillard decided were comparable to what Peter Slipper was accused of. They were not.
Because if he wants to know what misogyny looks like in modern Australia, he doesn't need a motion in the House of Representatives. He needs a mirror. That's what he needs. Misogyny, sexism, every day from this Leader of the Opposition. Every day, in every way. Apparently he's woken up after this track record and all of these statements. He's woken up and he's gone, oh dear, there's this thing called sexism. Oh, my Lord, there's this thing called misogyny. Now, who's one of them? Oh, the Speaker must be, because that suits my political purpose. Good sense, common sense, proper process is what should rule this parliament. That's what I believe is the path forward for this parliament, not the kind of double standards and political game playing imposed by the Leader of the Opposition. Now looking at his watch, because apparently a woman's spoken too long. I've had him yell at me to shut up in the past.
Oh, disgraceful, absolutely disgraceful. Gillard's adoring fans have long praised this as her great legacy, and they're correct in one sense. It is her only legacy of any note other than the broken tax promise, carbon tax, remember all that, and her gig as chair of the Clinton-affiliated Global Partnership for Education, which she got after being turfed out of office by Kevin Rudd and after successive Aussie governments had donated millions of dollars of taxpayers' money to the Clinton Foundation. The reality is, of course, that this was the moment identity politics became cemented into Australian politics, and we have been the poorer for it ever since. Before long, we got same-sex marriage, with the Libs dancing in the aisles of Parliament. We got talk of women's quotas for the Liberal Party, and the endless, preposterous claim that the coalition has a problem with women. When the most prominent example since then of a woman being hounded to death, according to her best friend, by parliamentary colleagues involved a cohort of Labor women, known as the Mean Girls, one of whom smirked her way through Gillard's misogyny speech. So, to paraphrase Gillard herself, we don't need to be lectured about how to treat women by Labor women. Thank you very much. Of course, one woman who stands head and shoulders over so many others, and who never had to rely on claims of victimhood, who didn't need a quota to get to the top, who wasn't offended if ever her colleagues dared to look at their watches or adjust their ties, and indeed who embraced her own femininity rather than being embarrassed by it, was of course Britain's first female Prime Minister and one of its greatest, the Conservative Margaret Thatcher.
I stand before you tonight in my red star chiffon evening gown, my face softly made up and my fair hair gently waved. The Iron Lady of the Western world.
Thatcher's legacy is unparalleled. She dragged Britain out of its post-war socialist torpor and turned it into an economic powerhouse. A legacy then squandered by Labor when they returned to office and by every bedwetting Conservative leader since. But unlike Gillard, when it came to her male opponents, Maggie approached them, as she did everything else, with self-confidence and wit.
They don't seem to make any concession to the fact that you're a woman, do they?
No, why should they? I mean, I don't make any concession to the fact that they're men. No. I do like arguing, absolutely flatly contrary to the image. We argue things out, and that is the way we come to a conclusion.
But in the end, they should agree with you.
In the end, we come to the right conclusion.
Margaret Thatcher was famous for sticking to her guns. Indeed, she coined one of the great political phrases over her own stubbornness.
To those waiting with bated breath for that favourite media catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say. U-turn if you want to. the ladies not for turning.
Margaret Thatcher has had her imitators, most recently Liz Truss, the third female Conservative Prime Minister in Great Britain. Labour, of course, hasn't had any. Liz Truss came in deliberately channeling Margaret Thatcher. I've applauded her decision to bring in dramatic tax cuts to turbocharge the economy. I also like how she wants to move the British Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, where it belongs, but this has been greeted with hysteria by the always anti-Israel British media and establishment. However, after bringing in all those Thatcherite measures to strengthen the British economy, correct measures, after only 38 days, Liz Truss has been forced to do what Thatcher never did and never would have done, the big U-turn. And on Friday, Truss capitulated to the money markets, fired her Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng and reinstated some of the taxes she and he were going to slash. According to the Weekend Australian, quote, the genesis of Friday's extraordinary sequence of events and the sacking of Kwarteng lies in the draft forecasts of the fiscal watchdog, the OBR. That's the Office for Budget Responsibility. The forecasts were said to be, quote, dire. So in other words, modelling. Modelling and money markets. Let's not forget, modelling by various bodies didn't exactly serve any of us well during COVID. As for the money markets, well, international investors was the big excuse, the only excuse, given to us by Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg for their disgraceful and treacherous U-turn on deciding to back net zero. A U-turn that is now plunging this country into potentially years of energy poverty. But I digress. Is the OBR's modelling on the British economy accurate? No, not according to the cigar-smoking, beer-swilling Health Minister Theresa Coffey, who insists that, quote, the government is still going to go for growth and is determined to prove the flipping OBR wrong. Another cabinet minister insists that the way the budget was done was wrong, but the intent was correct. Even more depressing, it is reported that the alternative options, namely deep cuts to public services, were deemed unpalatable. So there you have it. That's how modern economies are run, on the whim of hedge fund managers, based on dubious modelling and anything to avoid slashing the bloated socialist public services who leech off the hard-working taxpayers who pay for their entitled public service lifestyles. Here is Liz Truss yesterday.
I have asked Jeremy Hunt to become the new Chancellor. He's one of the most experienced and widely respected government ministers and parliamentarians, and he shares my convictions and ambitions for our country. We need to have a high-growth economy, but we have to recognise that we are facing very difficult issues as a country. And it was right, in the national interest, that I made the decisions I've made today to restore that economic stability.
Still, even in the turmoil, there was room for humour. One MP said that Truss's press conference was, quote, so wooden that getting rid of her wouldn't be regicide, it would be deforestation. The UK Telegraph blames the mess on, quote, an unholy coalition of the bond markets. There you go. The civil service. There you go. Much of the media. Yep. And most of all, Conservative MPs who have combined to shatter the agenda that the Prime Minister promised to implement, i.e. the bedwetters. The article laments that the dream, and this is so tragic, UK Telegraph says the dream of a low-tax, pro-business Britain is now dead for a generation. Perhaps the most insightful comment came from an MP who recognised that the problem with Liz Truss was that, quote, people projected onto her something that she wasn't. And of course we know what, or rather who, that something was. Margaret Thatcher. Perhaps Liz should have studied her a bit closer, because here is how Margaret Thatcher responded when a seemingly equally insurmountable, unholy coalition of adversaries tried to steer her off her chosen course.
Mr. Delors said at press conference the other day that he wanted the European Parliament to be the democratic body of the community, he wanted the Commission to be the executive, and he wanted the Council of Ministers to be the Senate. No, no, no.